Gary Stevenson is a future Bitcoiner, and I can prove it. I want to be on record April of 2025 so that when he flips to the good side, I can say I told you so. To be fair, it's probably going to take a while because he's already, unfortunately, publicly gone on record as anti-crypto and anti-Bitcoin. Part of his biggest problem being he conflates Bitcoin with crypto. But I've made a previous video kind of digging into him on his take on Bitcoin and explaining why he clearly has not studied it at all. But this video is not about digging into him at all. This video is about proving that he's a future Bitcoiner. Why? Because he's basically already there. He's 99% Bitcoin maxi already. He just doesn't know it yet. And by the end of this video, you're going to agree with me. And if you send it to him and he sees it, he'll agree with me too. And Gary, we'll welcome you when you're ready. So this is Gary being interviewed on the Prof G Markets show with Scott Galloway. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. Once he finally realizes sound money is the solution to everything he's complaining about, he's going to come over to the Bitcoin side. And real quick, if you don't know who he is, I'll just say he has a YouTube channel called Gary's Economics. He's formerly like a Citibank trader who was like supposedly the best trader they had, made millions of dollars or something. And now he makes content about economics. And he's getting a ton of attention, especially in the UK, but in the US too. So that's just a quick background on who he is. And for the record, I'm not a trader. He's probably way smarter than me in markets and trading. And he's probably way smarter than me in economics too. But he definitely hasn't studied Bitcoin yet. And I have.
What I saw was a generation, our parents' generation, of like poor property owners. And then I saw my generation of like kind of highly educated people who would never be able to afford property. It's basically the loss of the wealth of the middle class. And it totally answers the question of why aren't people spending money, right? Is these guys are spending more than their income over the long term. Their wealth is going down over the long term. I couldn't help but notice this like symmetry in the financial situation of my friends and their families and these major world governments. Spending more than income, dissaving assets, going further and further into debt.
So see, he's taking the same journey Bitcoiners take. He started to see the problem. Wait, we have this weird credit-based system. Everyone's supposed to spend money, but nobody can save money. Everyone's in debt up to their eyeballs. Governments borrow and spend money they don't have. They rack up debt that they can't pay back. And normal everyday people don't have any assets, don't have any savings, and can barely get by. So this is the beginning of the journey of a Bitcoiner. Like, wow, this whole system is so broken. It's almost as if there's something structurally broken about our money and the system at large. Most of us Bitcoiners like started at the exact same point.
Struck by, like the mathematician in me, was struck by the kind of impossibility of this. Like it shouldn't be possible for both private individuals and governments to simultaneously lose all their assets and go into debt.
You're right. It shouldn't be possible. We can just rack up more and more debt because there somehow seems to be more and more units of money in the system, but they always appear as debt. It's almost like that's how a credit-based economy works when you can print money and banks can create bank deposits out of thin air and governments can print money out of thin air. It creates a weird structural debt-based system that's built entirely on fake money.
Somebody has to own the assets and debt has to balance out, right? Somebody has to own the credit. We can't all go into debt at the same time. And I was trying to figure out like, well, where have all the assets gone, right? But obviously I'm working in like a skyscraper in Canary Wharf, surrounded by millionaires. And I'd been paid like more than $1 million in the previous 2 years. And I was like 24 or something. And it was just really obviously, it was us, right? We were the guys who were hoovering up the assets that ordinary families were losing, that governments were losing.
Is this not what Bitcoiners talk about constantly? The fact that the government has a money printer and can create money out of thin air. Remember the Cantillon effect. Those with cheap, easy access to the newly printed money have an advantage and can use that money to buy assets before that money trickles deeper into the rest of the economy and everyone else experiences inflation. And money printing causes inflation, and inflation is a two-sided coin. Inflation pumps asset prices, so it makes scarce, desirable things go up in price because there's more units of currency chasing those scarce, desirable things like real estate and stocks. And the other side of the coin is price inflation of goods and services. So if you own assets, you see your wealth grow, at least in nominal value, because your assets go up. And if you're poor or middle class and you don't own assets, everything gets more and more expensive and your wages don't keep up. Even if they keep up with a CPI inflation, which is a fake juiced up number, they don't keep up with real inflation, which is the rate of monetary expansion.
That's when I realized that what you have here is a structural change in the wealth distribution. We, the UK, and it's the same in the US, used to be middle-class societies with wealth-holding governments, and we are becoming basically elite societies with bankrupt governments and no middle class. And the thing that I realized immediately was, well, if the governments and the middle class can't run a balanced budget when they own their own assets, well, they definitely can't run a balanced budget when they don't own their own assets. And if the rich can afford to hoover up everything when they only own like half the assets, the more assets they accumulate, the faster they're going to hoover it up. And I could see very quickly we were going to basically accelerate relatively quickly towards the complete dispossession of the middle class, the complete bankrupting of Western governments. And that basically like this would just get worse and worse and worse, basically. And I knew immediately that the trade there was to bet on interest rates being zero forever.
And so here's the problem where his TradFi background holds him back. So he could see the entire problem and the scope of everything. Now he sees it only through the lens of a trader. So he's like, oh, I'm going to bet that interest rates are going to stay low forever because it has to. Because like we just said, a credit-based, debt-based system of printing money all the time is essentially a Ponzi scheme. It cannot survive without the continued injection of liquidity, of more newly printed money. There's too much debt and everything is too dependent on pumping of asset prices. So without the injection of more new money, everything will collapse. Well, what does that mean? That means interest rates have to stay low. So he's seeing the whole picture, but he only sees it through the lens of a trader. I'm sure he made money off it by trading. The thing he didn't see was Bitcoin. He probably would have made a lot more money if he had seen that in 2011.
It's impossible to argue that wealth inequality hasn't gone parabolic recently. But one of our theses is that the incumbents will argue that it's all these external exogenous factors that, oh, it's such a shame, but they're sort of out of our control. Globalization, agility, scale effects, that there's all these things that are sort of out of their control. And one of our core tenets is actually this was a conscious decision that we as voters and specifically governments and the people in power have made. The wealth inequality was a decision.
So by the way, this is Scott Galloway, and he's basically the slightly older U.S. equivalent of Gary Stevenson, because he talks about a lot of the same stuff, the wealth inequality and all the problems stemming from that. I've heard him say he's actually had lunch with Michael Saylor and had Bitcoin explained to him, and he still doesn't quite get it. So I'm not sure how that works, but he doesn't hate Bitcoin. Like I saw someone asked a question and he answered in one of his other podcast episodes where he basically told the person like, yeah, a small allocation to Bitcoin is totally reasonable. So like he's not anti-Bitcoin. He kind of gets it a little bit. He just kind of hasn't come all the way around yet. So just to say that about Scott Galloway. But what he's saying is true. Wealth inequality is a choice. Why? Because we all choose to believe in Keynesian economics, and we all choose to apparently believe that we need a system where inflation is required and governments should be able to print money and banks should be able to print money. That, the fundamental core, drives this wealth inequality. So yeah, we did make a choice essentially when we started central banking that was the situation we were going to have. It's just that most people still don't realize that that's where it all traces back to.
And the big thing for me was COVID. I think COVID tells us a lot about what we understand and don't understand as a society. So the total UK government deficit since the beginning of COVID is just over £1 trillion, which is £20,000 per adult. The US number is like $13 trillion, which is something crazy, like $50,000 per US adult, something like that. It was relatively obvious, really right at the beginning of COVID, that we were going to see these enormous government deficits.
You see what I'm saying? It's basically in Bitcoiner. He understands money printer go burr. Governments will inject liquidity. That's what they do. Because the system is so fragile, they have to, or everything will collapse.
Everybody should have been saying, who is going to get £1 trillion richer? Who is going to get $13 trillion richer? It was very obvious at the very beginning of COVID that we were going to see some kind of significant change in the wealth distribution, that governments were going to get really significantly poorer, and that somebody was going to get richer. It's not that hard to see that that money is overwhelmingly going to end up being held by the richest people.
Exactly. Because rich people can use newly printed money to buy assets, and those assets are pumped in price by money printing itself.
There's a few obvious things that will happen in markets, right? Like if you know that governments are effectively in the overall system going to give $13 trillion to the richest people in the country, then you know with certainty that the stock price will go up. The stock markets will go up. You know with certainty that the gold price will go up. You know with certainty that house prices will go up. These are obvious things. From what I see, our economists are really, 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 really bad.
He even sees the problem that Keynesian economics is the problem. So all economics taught in schools is Keynesian economics. Is all economists are really bad. Right, because they're teaching the wrong thing. They fundamentally believe the wrong things. So he even sees that. All right, quick pause to say, if you like this video at all, share it with someone who you think might enjoy it, and share it with Gary's Economics. Why not? Liking the video, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff gives signal to the YouTube algorithm, pushes out to more people so we can get more people to understand Bitcoin. Like Gary. All right, back to the video.
Good young economists are enormously financially incentivized not to become public sphere economists. Basically, very effectively separated the economists who are incentivized to really understand what's happening from the economists who are allowed to speak publicly and influence policy.
He's saying what Saifedean Ammous talks about all the time, the author of the Bitcoin Standard. He's an economist, but he talks about the fact that in mainstream economics, in universities, and in government, everyone is a Keynesian economist. Why is that? Well, if you're not a Keynesian economist, you don't get to be an economist in a university or in a government. You don't get to be a government economist if you say we shouldn't have a money printer and we should kill the central bank. They don't put you in a government economist position. And they don't let you teach that in most economics classes in universities.
Give us the basics, the underpinnings, the forces that have driven this wealth inequality.
Wealth inequality is usually high. In most of history, most of the world, it is high. It decreased significantly in the 20th century because of World War II, essentially, for a variety of reasons. It stayed much lower for a long period of time until the 80s, when we significantly cut taxes on the rich. To be honest, as soon as you do that, once you do that, the rich start accumulating money and they start accumulating assets. And then really, there's nothing happening here other than compound interest, which is that once these guys start accumulating interest, they start outcompeting the poor, and the poor start selling assets. And then the rich have more assets, which means they have more passive income, which means they can start to outcompete the government, they can start to outcompete the middle class. And what we are seeing as an asset price bubble is really just the rich accumulating assets and getting richer and richer and richer, which means a larger amount of this passive income getting pumped to the rich every year. And rich people have a low marginal propensity to consume, which means they buy assets. Which means this is why for most of history, inequality has been high. Really, the unusual thing that's happening is not what is happening now, is what happened for the 50 years after World War II. Once the inequality is very high, then you have these flows of cash from governments and from ordinary people towards the owners of the assets. If you don't do anything, the rich will squeeze all of the remaining assets out of government and the middle class. You have to introduce a flow of cash, a flow of wealth away from the richest. Realistically, this has to be taxation. And for me, I think what you want to be doing is you want to be trying to find a way to tax asset hoarding.
So a wealth tax.
He basically almost always arrives at the only solution he can really come up with is tax the rich more. We need a wealth tax. I'm not even interested in like the political argument of whether we should tax the rich more or not. Number one, I think that there's a fundamental flaw in that argument that he sort of acknowledged already earlier when he talked about the ineffectiveness of government. You're basically saying the government is this ineffective entity that's making all these mistakes, and all the economists and everyone in the government is a dum-dum, doesn't know what they're doing. But let's take a bunch of money away from rich people and give it to the government, and the government will do a good job of figuring out what to do with it. And we've already established that structurally, it's a feature of the system to have this wealth inequality continue. It's not a bug. It's the way the system was designed. To me, to say there's the existence of this money printer, and in my opinion, the money printer is causing all this, we won't address that. We'll just say, well, the money printer causes the wealth inequality gap to widen. It exacerbates the problem. It makes all these rich people more and more wealthy. They can borrow more money to buy more assets, and then inflation pumping the value of all their assets, and everybody else is getting poorer relatively because everybody else owns a smaller percentage of the total overall monetary supply because the money supply keeps growing. But let's not address the fact that that's the core, most fundamental layer of the system. And let's just say, well, the rich keep getting richer, but we'll just keep printing money. We won't stop that part, but then we'll just tax more of the money away from the rich. And then the government will do a good job of redistributing it. It just fundamentally breaks down if you're saying the idea is, oh, well, if the money printer keeps making these rich people richer, okay, well, let's just take some more of their money away from them. Well, first of all, the money printer is going to keep going and making them richer and richer. So we just have to keep taking more and more from them. And you have this system that's designed to make this problem keep going, but somehow we're going to figure out how to, within that system and within that government, redistribute that money to people. It just fundamentally doesn't make sense to me as a solution.
The wealthy are the most mobile people in the world. And when France introduces a wealth tax, Arnaud decides he loves Brussels and he moves to Belgium. The wealth taxes are difficult to enforce.
And I do agree with this, which is that the more you just try to tax rich people, the more they'll just move away.
The majority of my friends who are wealthy are piecing out to Milan or Dubai.
I'm not religious about wealth taxes as the solution. I think raising tax on income of very wealthy people would be beneficial. But I think it's important to recognize if you raise tax on the income of the rich, all that is going to do is slow down the rate at which inequality increases. If you want to actually improve living standards, you probably do need to think about, will this wealth ever be returned to the people?
He's not even religious about it being a wealth tax being the solution. So in his mind, he's thinking, well, I understand it kind of doesn't really work. That solution is not perfect. Yeah, you know why? Because it doesn't solve the actual fundamental structural problem. The whole thing is about how do we reverse the flows of money going to the rich. And if we tax them more, it only slows it down. Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point. Do you see my point? This is why he's so close to becoming a Bitcoiner. This is what all of us talk about nonstop all the time, and why we bring everything back to kill the money printer. All these problems are externalities of the money printer. And all these other solutions are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic because they don't solve the fundamental problem.
To be honest, really, more than anything, I'm someone who's identified a problem and I want to start a conversation about what are the possible alternatives.
Gary, you got to understand, the number one possible alternative is sound money, separation of money and state. This is one of the fundamental innovations, the fundamental change that we have today, now that we have the technology called Bitcoin. Never before in human history do we have the ability to separate money and state in this way. For the first time, we have the technology that can do it. And as Joe Bryan said in my recent interview with him, there will be a movement for the separation of money and state, a national movement, a global movement, in the same way there previously was a movement for the separation of church and state. But now we have the technology to separate money from state and to kill the money printer and to bring the world back to sound money. And each of us as individuals can start on our own by just buying Bitcoin. You can separate money from state on your own. You don't even have to wait for other people to realize or for governments to realize. So this is where they were just talking about like, oh, well, what's the structural way to reverse these flows and to make sure that money travels back into the middle class and the poor instead of only travels to the rich who own assets? Well, the number one way is you as an individual buy Bitcoin. I've talked about this in many of my other videos. History shows that the hardest money wins. So when a harder money gets introduced into a system, it cannot be stopped. It will suck all the value out of the weaker money slowly over time. What that means is all these fiat currencies are weaker money. Bitcoin will suck the value out of them over time. So if you own Bitcoin, more and more value will accrue to you no matter what. You don't need a structural solution to solve the wealth inequality problem. You individually are solving it for yourself because more and more value and more wealth will accrue to you as a Bitcoin holder because you hold the hardest money, the scarcest asset that human beings have ever known. So even if money printing globally were to stop today, it's never going to happen. You own the hardest money on earth. And history tells you that hard money will demonetize weaker monies over time. So all the value in other monies and other stores of value will flow into Bitcoin over time. But we also know the money printer is not going to stop. So the more and more fiat currencies get printed, more and more of that value will make its way into Bitcoin. And it's actually been shown by studies that Bitcoin price is driven by global liquidity. The more money gets pumped into the system, the more Bitcoin moves up in value. So all you have to do is individually set yourself up to separate money from state, save your purchasing power and your wealth, store it in hard money, and you solve this problem. Listen, some people complain about wealth inequality in Bitcoin, and I'm like, Bitcoin was never promised that it was going to solve systemic global wealth inequality. But if that's the biggest thing you're worried about, all you have to do is own Bitcoin, and you've solved that problem for yourself.
The wealthy just get wealthier unless you consciously redistribute money into the middle class. The middle class is not a naturally occurring organism. If you don't support it and redistribute money from the wealthy who weaponize government and naturally have just these huge advantages, it withers, which is what is happening now in this common trope or myth of the incumbents, is that the middle class, the market will figure out the middle class on its own. I think what I hear you saying is no. It's really important and it requires a redistribution back.
So I think I would agree for the most part that historically that's pretty accurate. Like extreme wealth inequality probably was largely true. The middle class being this historical abnormality, that's probably pretty true. Like if you think about the middle class, the way we know it today, emerging after the Industrial Revolution and expanding after World War II, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But here's the fundamental thing. I think Keynesian economics would basically say a strong middle class is built and maintained by government policy, essentially, by progressive taxation, unions, social safety nets, etc. And you might point to that era and those policies as like helping to build out the middle class. And then a lot of people just point to, they'll say, the erosion of those policies is part of what's killing the middle class. Austrian economics, I think, would say a middle class can emerge through free markets. Property rights are key, and sound money is the key. Austrians would definitely argue forced redistribution through the state distorts incentives and distorts markets. This is a very theoretical debate because it's basically impossible to say. If you're saying the middle class is only a phenomenon of like the last century, and the last century, we've only ever had Keynesian economics in the West. So we've only had these government intervention programs to prop up the middle class. So we don't know what it actually looks like in a free market with sound money. That basically doesn't exist. But like I said before, it's pretty hard for me to agree that government intervention And government redistribution of wealth is somehow the solution, especially if you fundamentally agree that the existence of the money printer is what's exacerbating and driving and creating the problem in the first place. You need to replace that system with a sound money system before you'll ever even know whether you need government intervention down the road. You have to rip out the base layer, replace it with sound money, and let the free market figure it out. And if you watch any of my most recent interviews with Joe Bryant or with Seb Bunny, there are just so many examples of how government intervention distorts markets and creates terribly misaligned incentives. And government intervention just constantly creates problems that then people say we need more government intervention to solve. Again, with this whole discussion being we need to solve these problems that central banking and government intervention create in the first place. So saying, well, central banking and government intervention is creating all these problems in the first place. Let's have more government intervention to solve them. It just doesn't track from first principles. From that standpoint, you're just only going to keep getting more and more and more intervention from the government and never actually solving the problems, just band-aiding one problem after the other.
Kind of what you're saying is that throughout history, inequality is a natural force. Inequality begets more inequality. And the only thing that sort of undoes that is a trigger event that causes a redistribution among our society.
First of all, switching from fiat money to sound money definitely is a redistribution mechanism, a mechanism that is going to benefit anyone who holds sound money. But also, what sound money does is allows you to protect your purchasing power and your wealth and the stored value of your labor into the future. So if you hold a percentage of the total overall monetary supply and you know that that percentage is not going to be debased, not only can you save and plan for the future, but if you've read The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, the entire world, all humans and all markets and all companies are working to get more efficient, more productive, to essentially produce more from less input. So what that means is if you have sound money, prices fall over time. So the real purchasing power of your wealth grows. You don't have to be on this rat race trying to constantly get more and more units of money because your money is being debased. The money you earn and the money you save increases in purchasing power over time, and you get more and more wealthy, more and more abundance. So again, sound money fixes this idea of the wealth gap is growing, because you could just be in the sort of lower or more or middle class, but the money you have grows in value in real terms, in purchasing power terms over time as prices fall, as everything in society gets cheaper and more efficient and more productive. So the point is, like, if you're getting better off over time just by working and earning and saving in the thing that you earn, your quality of life is going up and you're becoming better off. Doesn't that solve the need for government intervention to redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the middle and lower class?
What we could be striving towards is some sort of redistribution mechanism that doesn't involve death, pain, and suffering. I feel like that's...
Yes, we have it. It was created in 2008. It was released in January of 2009. It's called Bitcoin. We have the mechanism. We don't need a violent, bloody upheaval or a revolution. We have the tool. We have the tool to do it at the nation state level, and we have the tool to do it at the individual level. These guys are 99% of the way there to being Bitcoiners. They're talking about the entire problem the way Bitcoiners talk about it. They're desperately trying to find what could be a solution that could solve this problem. What if there was something we could do? But they just keep coming back to this sort of old lens, Keynesian fishbowl solution that people have tried in different countries for a long time. Well, we need to tax and redistribute. We just need to tax and redistribute. And like we've known in the past, that leads to communism and socialism, and those didn't work. So it's just spinning our wheels, coming up with different versions of the same old solution. Now we have a new technological solution that can do this, that can solve this problem. You're so close.
The conversation needs to be being had. At the moment, the conversation is not being had. I think the question is
being had by Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners are the ones having the conversation. We are having it. Come have it with us. Like, I know there's a lot of Bitcoiners who like maybe don't like this guy, but I'm like, this guy would be a powerful ally. He's got a big following. He does a really good job of promoting himself and getting himself out there and talking about this stuff. We gotta get Gary on the team, man.
I think if we're being realistic about how to achieve this change, you have to accept that we are a long, long way away from ever having the power to implement these taxes. I think what needs to be done is more people need to understand, in the absence of something being done here to stop inequality from rapidly rising, we will see really, really aggressive, fast, dramatic falls in living standards in the UK, in the US, across the Western world.
And therefore, buy Bitcoin. All of us. This is what Bitcoiners are saying constantly. Yeah, we want Bitcoin to kill the money printer and get to the nation state level and fix the money from the core. But if we're far away from that, or if we don't have the political will or the power or the time or whatever, that's going to be too hard. It's going to take too long, or we can't do that yet. at the individual level, you can solve this problem by buying Bitcoin, studying Bitcoin, and telling everyone you know about Bitcoin. This is why Bitcoiners sound crazy when we bring everything back to sound money and back to Bitcoin and back to separation of money and state. But I guarantee you, if this dude did a little bit of study and did the homework and got Bitcoin, he would never be able to stop talking about it. He would probably lose 90% of his following overnight when he started talking about Bitcoin, because people would be like, he's lost it, he's gone crazy. Because most people still don't understand Bitcoin. But his mind will be blown the day he finally gets Bitcoin and understands that it can solve all these problems he spent so much time thinking about, worrying about, talking about, wondering about. He'll be like, holy effing shit. This solution was right under my nose for 16 years and I was ignoring it. And now I just need to shout it from the mountaintops. That day will happen. I guarantee you. If he puts his ego aside and forgets that he trashed Bitcoin in the past, or other people are going to attack him if he comes out as a Bitcoiner. If he's able to put his ego aside, this day is coming.
I think the more people that recognize that, the more we can start having this conversation on the basis of something needs to be done. But the truth is we are a long way away from that at the moment. So I always view this as really two separate battles, which is one, technically what do you need to do to the tax system? But two, what do you have to do to actually get any changes done at all? Because the reality is active changes are being made at the moment to reduce taxes on the rich. Rich are taking more and more power every year. They're getting more and more control over politics, more and more control over media. We are not moving in the right direction, even in the argument. So in my mind, I always split it into two separate things, which is winning the argument and changing the tax system. Because people always push me to changing the tax system, when the truth is we are going to lose the argument. And the reality of that is in the next 20 years, you will see collapse into widespread, desperate poverty of ordinary people in the UK, in the US, in Europe, across the world. So really, you do have to win the argument first.
In conclusion, study Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, tell people you love about Bitcoin, tweet at Gary's Economics, and get him to look into Bitcoin. When he puts his ego aside and he studies Bitcoin, it's game over. He's never going back. All right, you get it. I've made my point. Gary is a future Bitcoiner. I guarantee it. There's no doubt in my mind. Now, I did do another video, like I talked about, where I dug into him a little bit harder. I was a little harsher on Gary in the other video. Sorry, Gary. But he was trashing Bitcoin. I had to correct his mistakes. I think you should watch that video if you haven't seen it yet. You can watch that one right here. And as always, never forget, Bitcoin's inevitable.